Thank you for tuning into the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. It's May 2018, and you're listening to episode 74 of Postmodern Realities, and I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. On this episode, I'm joined by Kyle Keating. Kyle teaches history, theology, and apologetics at Providence Classical Christian Academy in St. Louis, Missouri. He received his BA from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and his MDiv from Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis. In the volume 41, number 3 issue of the Christian Research Journal, Kyle wrote a Postmodern Realities article, and the title of his article is called Cream or Sugar, Fostering Authentic Community in the Expanding Age of Social Media. Kyle, it's good to have you on.
Thanks, Melanie. Thank you very much for having me on as well.
Well, I don't know about you, but I am actually someone, even though I'm not in your same generation, I'm a Gen Xer, I am someone who actually regularly uses social media. So I don't personally feel like social media is 100% bad. So I just, from your point of view, what do you think are some positive contributions regarding social media and community?
Sure. And I think anytime we start this conversation, it's easy to move immediately to what are potential problems or pitfalls. But I do think it is helpful to start with the positives. And as someone who uses social media myself, I also believe that there are positives there. Otherwise, it'd be a hard argument to make for continuing to use it. There are some fairly obvious positive contributions that I think we can recognize pretty intuitively based on how we actually use social media. So obviously one of the things would be the ability to connect with distant family and friends. So I think in my own personal experience, the way this shows up is in my ability to connect with family that are in various states scattered throughout the country, keeping up with, new births and nephews and nieces growing up and that sort of thing, in ways that would have never been possible 20 or 30 years ago. And then friends too. So, having graduated from college and moved on from that stage, you go through that experience of having your friends scatter across the country, getting various jobs and starting families and all those different sort of life stages. And social media lets me, stay connected to those people, albeit in limited ways. There's still real connection there and the opportunity to kind of see even what the Lord is doing in their lives, even from a long ways away. Another potential positive contribution that I've experienced is just the ability to make new connections with people in sort of sub-communities or with areas of interest or hobby that maybe there aren't a ton of people that live immediately around me that share those same interests. So I think about a few things like, for example, I'm a big fan of Arsenal Football Club, which is a London-based soccer team. And, as one might imagine, there aren't a ton of people that keep up on like British soccer that live in my immediate circles. There are some, but lots of my connections surrounding that interest in that soccer team are really built online and are cultivated via social media and places like Twitter especially. I think of a couple other my niche interests like board games or theology are places where conversations online can really expose me, for example, to new board games I hadn't ever heard of. And with theology, I feel like my own sort of theological knowledge is often sharpened by exposing myself to these conversations that are happening among really astute theologians, but they're sometimes happening even in the context of social media or on Twitter or something like that.
Well, I agree with you. One of the things that's been helpful for me, even professionally, is connecting with various people who write for our magazine. And I don't think I would have seen a more personal side of them had I not connected to them on social media. So as a matter of fact, one of our writers who's a big board game fan, and I am too, we actually ended up having an article based on that. And we've had a past podcast episode on that article just because I realized there was somebody in our circle of writers that was a board gaming fan, and also one of our other writers is a huge Arsenal fan. So I don't know that I would have known about Arsenal before, but I do now because he's also a Facebook friend. So I can see how this would be. Back in April, we had John Dyer on the podcast, and he has written some books on technology. And one of the things he says in his one of his books on technology is that, anytime something's new, we think it's a bad thing. So in the old days, we'd say, oh, people were on the telephone for hours at a time. That's so unhealthy. And of course, I don't know how many people would even do that anymore unless it's a business call. So what do you think social media, what makes it different from other forms of communication? Like, for instance, telephone calls or even texting people or, putting a comment up on a blog post.
Sure. And it's certainly true that we can have either one of those sort of initial reactions to new technology, either the immediate rejection because it's new and it's, we can imagine all sorts of terrible problems, or that it's necessarily good because it's new. And I think that phenomena exists as well. And as far as social media is concerned, there are a few ways in which it's a little bit different than, if you call someone or you're texting someone or even something like a group text. So you have the immediacy of that would be the same as a group text where there's not very much time or a very thick filter between thinking something and saying it or posting it. And so that immediacy of social media means that there's this sort of real-time live conversation that can happen, which can be really productive and really helpful, but it also means that there's less time for filtering, what am I going to say? Checking, is this actually a productive thing to say? Is this actually helpful? Some of those normal checks that we would have before we would broadcast something to lots of people, those things don't really exist in social media. And that leads me kind of my second point. Social media is public media. Even if you have your privacy settings set a certain way, really anything you post on the internet has the potential to be public. And so in the past, we would have thought about, well, if I'm going to write something that, thousands of people could potentially read, I'm going to go through an editor. I'm going to make sure that I have, multiple people proofreading what I say. These are kind of the sort of standard processes that go along with publishing material to a broad audience. And social media basically gives you all of that public reach and that scope with very little accountability, with very little sort of oversight or, editorial recommendations or those sort of things. And so it's a potentially dangerous combination of immediacy combined with a sort of huge public platform with very little in between my thinking something and my saying something to lots and lots of people. And so that can be potentially dangerous, but it also has a huge capacity for communicating things out to large numbers of people. And we sometimes could talk about social media as having a sort of democratizing effect on publishing and on information, that there's the ability that any person has the ability to build this kind of platform. And that can be a really good thing, but it can also be a bad thing depending on who has the platform and what they're using it for.
So what do you think about social media that's really alluring to people? I mean, what do you think that people find really attractive about the platform or the medium?
Yeah, so kind of building off what I just said, that notion of lots of scope very quickly is certainly one of the draws. So the fact that I can get recognition by thousands or millions of people if I just tweet the right thing, or if this Instagram picture is just attractive enough, or whatever the thing is that's drawing the clicks, that there's this temptation of if I just post the right thing, I can go viral, going viral being perceived as something that will give me a sense of fame or recognition. And so I think there's that draw of I want to be recognized, by people. Beyond that, I think, even maybe that has some negative connotations, but thinking more positively, that sense of belonging. So kind of coming back to the ability to make connections on niche interests. C.S. Lewis is always famous for saying that there's this moment at the start of friendship where one person says to the other, what, you two? I thought I was the only one. This notion of finding other people that have the same interests as you, that are just as passionate as you about something that felt so unique on one hand. And so I think there's that aspect of belonging that social media can offer that is pretty powerful. And I said the last thing is just, and again, drawing kind of previously on what we talked about with connecting with family and friends, that potential to connect with other people is very powerful. The ability to connect with people that you wouldn't otherwise know. And sometimes even social media's mediated connection, the fact that it's happening online or not necessarily face-to-face, can actually allow for people to take certain risks in allowing themselves to be known that they wouldn't in another context, or they wouldn't maybe feel as safe in another context. So I think that's a real desire for connection that can be met via social media as well.
I think that's a really good point. I would say, especially specifically on Facebook, when you talk about connecting with people you kind of know in real life. Some people that I know in real life, they're kind of more introverted and quiet, but on social media, they have just so many thoughts and opinions that I don't know. I wouldn't have known that they had those thoughts and opinions because in real life, they don't express them verbally. So I think that's a one good benefit for them, that they can connect to more people than they would feel uncomfortable with just because of their temperament, really. So just thinking about social media and community in specific, what are some things that are limiting, or just maybe, I don't want to say negative, but maybe some things that are cautionary about social media?
So I think one of the big ones is this illusion that social media can give us that we can be everywhere and know everyone. Because we have the capacity to, tweet out something and, give a mention to a celebrity, or even a famous theologian or something like that. Even sort of minor celebrities or something like that gives us the sense of like we can know anybody, and because we can do that with anyone anywhere in the world, there's this notion that community becomes this. Or the potential of community means that begs the question or suggests the question that maybe I don't need to be so limited to my particular place where I'm living, the physical locale, the people that I see in the flesh day in, day out. So I think that's a potential danger, is that suggestion that maybe that we can sort of go beyond our own bodies, and maybe we don't even need the community that's immediately around us. But I think, so if I could summarize like the dangers or risks of social media in sort of three things. The first I'd say is that social media as a community tends to be totalizing. And let me explain what I mean by that. It's totalizing in the sense that it has a tendency to push out other forms of relationship and communication. So in order to be fully invested in my social media account, if I'm going to keep up with all my mentions and comments and whatever, I need to have access to that all the time. It means I need to have my cell phone on me. I need to be getting push notifications. And even the structure and programming of social media drives this kind of involvement with social media, that programmers are intentional in creating incentives to get you to check your accounts with a great deal of regularity. And what that does is it pushes out other forms of community. It pushes out other contexts in which we could know and be known in the flesh. I mean, think about very personal. Think about sitting on the couch with my wife at home, and the amount of time that we sit next to each other on our phones, scrolling through social media. That's and again, it's not intrinsically bad, but one could see how you end up with this situation where you're spending all your time dealing with people that are millions of miles away, and you've got someone sitting immediately next to you on the couch that you're not giving your full presence to. So I think that's that totalizing and even potentially addictive component of social media is a major limitation, because social media, we sometimes say, well, social media is okay for what it is if you just keep it in its little niche and don't let it take over your life. But there is a sense in which some of the design of social media demands more and more of ourselves. And it's hard to push back against that. It takes a lot of intentionality. I think another thing I would say is that social media can have a tendency to be a sort of performative art, that it suggests to us that on the internet, our primary job is to advertise our best selves. And so we have the opportunity to sort of carefully manicure a image of who we are, right? Think of Instagram and the ability to not just edit pictures, but even select which pictures are you going to post? What moments of your life are you going to take pictures of? And oftentimes, I think if we were to look at the motives of why we pick certain things, I don't think that they're always pure, that there's an element of this that can be almost driven by our consumeristic culture, the sense of I need to sell myself either to, someone who might be potentially interested in a romantic relationship. Maybe I need to sell myself to potential employers, to potential friends. I don't think we think about that in consumeristic marketing terms, but sometimes I think we approach it that way. And so there's this for a generation, my own generation, that seems to be obsessed with the notion of authenticity. It's a strange paradox that we're also so deeply embedded in social media that often undermines authenticity by encouraging us to sort of carefully manicure an image that we're going to present to the world. So I think that's another potential danger. And the last one I'd say is this danger that social media could become a sort of ideological echo chamber where all the people that we friend or follow are people that think exactly the same as ourselves. And so we can say whatever we want, and we're sure to get lots of likes or favorites or whatever, because we know that the people that we're following and are following us think the same way that we do. And what this can do is it serves as a sort of form of cheap affirmation. And it, after a fashion, can really encourage a type of tribalism where we view everybody outside of that subgroup as sort of them, the other, the potential enemy. And so all of our social media posting ends up becoming, what's sometimes called virtue signaling, right? Indicating to my fellow peers what I believe, because I know that everyone around me is going to approve of this position. And it's cheap affirmation because it doesn't actually require us to do anything, right? Like that's probably, we say one of the weaknesses of virtue signaling is it allows us all the reward of being perceived as virtuous without any of the substance of actually having to go be virtuous in any sort of tangible way. And so I think that'd be the other major danger, is that potential of creating an echo chamber where we're never challenged by ideas outside of our camp and never forced to think really critically about those things.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest, Kyle Keating, has wrote a Postmodern Realities article in the Volume 41, Number 3 issue of the Christian Research Journal, and his article is called Cream or Sugar? Fostering Authentic Community in the Expanding Age of Social Media. To read Kyle's article, please subscribe to the journal. A 6-issue subscription is now at a new lower price of $33.50, and to subscribe online, go to our website, equip.org. You were just talking about some of the pitfalls of social media and the totalizing nature of it. So how do Christians push back against that? Just the tribalism, the echo chamber, and some of the things that are some downfalls of social media.
Yeah, so I think, one way to push back, especially on the totalizing nature, the way in which it pushes out all other forms of community and relationship, is to place real limits on the places and spaces that we allow technology generally and social media specifically to rule us. And here I lean heavily on the book that Andy Crouch just published this past year called The Tech-Wise Family. I think he gives some really good suggestions about how to resist the totalizing nature of technology, how to allow it or create space for it, while also being very intentional about creating space that technology or social media can't get into. So he gives a bunch of really practical suggestions, like having an hour each day, a day each week, and a week each year that's tech-free. And I think we could translate that same sort of notion to social media. Obviously, one of the more popular ways recently that Christians specifically have sought to push back against this has been by taking time away from social media during Lent or something like that. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in that sort of intentional limitation of our use of social media, because it reminds us that, yes, we can continue to live and survive without the connections of social media, that these things aren't ultimate, while also appreciating the opportunities for community that are immediately around us.
So I just also want to find out a little bit more about how these issues deal with community, right? Because your article is about community and social media. So to what extent can social media enable Christians to develop the type of community that's consistent with something that's not so narrow, I guess, that sometimes social media does present itself to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, social media can be a really useful tool for building and growing that kind of community. I think the key is just that we need to be careful not to absorb its weaknesses and limitations unwittingly without realizing it. But, like one of the ways that social media does function in a particularly profitable way in terms of developing community for Christians is thinking about like online support groups that are formed on Facebook or something like that for people that have a sort of shared trial or life situation or whatever like that. Those can be really meaningful connections with people that share a struggle that it would be really hard to find somebody in your immediate community with that struggle, because it's particularly unique or particularly challenging or that sort of thing. So think about like the notion of a support group. Like social media has created the potential and the ability for that to exist for people that otherwise would have never had access to that. And so I think that's just sort of one example of social media enabling Christians to engage in healthy community. And and I think that offers a lot of possibilities in terms of thinking about, okay, what does this relationship between social media and community look like?
So how does this really relate to just our faith? Thinking through like limitations that social media has, but yet benefits about connecting, like you said, if you had a support group if you're struggling with something, or maybe you have a specific illness that you can only find people that might not have that in your area. How can we relate that more to where we're grounded in terms of being involved in a local church or being active in reaching out in our community?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the big thing to note is even when we're talking about like an online support group or something like that, like even that sort of community can't actually be your only source of community, or at least it ideally isn't. That's hopefully an extension of a much more local community. And I think we get this idea of the importance of the locality of the community that's immediately in front of us, actually from the gospel, from our own, from the Christian story, right? The fact that Jesus himself becomes incarnate, right? Taking on human flesh reminds us that one of the ways that God knows us and loves us is by taking on our flesh and becoming one of us and walking among us. And so this notion of if God himself is willing to become in the flesh in order to know us and love us and express that love through his life and death and resurrection, then there's something about the tangible, material, immediate presence of of people that actually matters. Because if the tangible, immediate presence of God matters for the gospel, as it does in the incarnation, then it suggests that sort of by implication, that we need that sort of tangible material in the flesh, knowing and being known, loving and being loved by other people as well. So I think that's a huge implication of the gospel as we think about community, is that if Jesus is willing to become incarnate in the flesh, then our calling as Christians is to have a community that is also in the flesh, that we need to be known and loved by people that actually see us face to face, not even just via FaceTime or Skype or something like that, but very immediately in our physical presence. The need to be able to be touched by other people. These are all parts of meaningful community that are impossible via social media, that we know that we need because God created us to have bodies. And our bodies are good things. They're good parts of what it means to be created in His image, even though they limit us and prevent us from being multiple places at once. That this is actually part of God's design. And so then the local church becomes an extension of that, right? If this is true about Christ, that He is incarnate, was incarnate among us, and is still today, even in the flesh, then for the local church too, it matters that we have a community of fellow believers that are in the flesh, that know us, that can serve us by knowing and loving us in this very immediate sense.
So how, talking about the local church, how do you think community in a local body can address some of the limitations of social media that we've been talking about? And then also, how can you encourage people who do feel a little bit reticent to get involved in a local church because maybe they had a bad experience in the local church and they feel like it's more safe for them, to just get their quote unquote community online?
Mm-hmm. Well, and so to start with your second question and move back to the first, I think it's worth noting that there's a very legitimate sense in which people do have experiences with the local church that have been scarring or wounding and make the local church feel unsafe, and that this is a real thing, and it's a very, very sad thing. But obviously, ultimately, our reaction to that can't be to withdraw from any sort of immediate community and keep everybody at the arm's length that social media allows, because ultimately that's actually giving in to the wounds and pain that we've experienced, because it's allowing that to dictate how we engage in community. It's actually allowing that to limit us from engaging in deep, meaningful community. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be wise, especially if you, or that it's not understandable if you've been wounded by the local church. But I do think it's worth noting that that a withdrawal from that community ultimately is letting pain and our suffering dictate to us the degree of community that we can or should have. And I think the gospel pushes back against that and suggests that actually we do need that kind of community, and it is there in the church. Even though the church is flawed in 1,000 ways. To go back to your question before that, though, how can the local church actually address some of the weaknesses of social media? I think there's a few things that the local church does for us that push back against kind of each of the components of social media that I said were limiting. So if social media is totalizing, one of the things that the local church does is provides what the Catholic theologian Henry Nouwen would call the ministry of presence. It allows this immediate presence of another person in our lives that's in the flesh. It's a tangible presence, but it's also costly and limited, right? So in order for someone else to be fully present with me in the flesh, that means they have to say no to everybody else in that moment in order to be fully with me. And that in and of itself conveys a sense of worth and value, that I'm actually worth listening to, that I'm worth spending time with, because this person put their phone away, because this person has chosen to not spend this time with somebody else. And so there's something communicated merely in presence that we get from a community like the local church that can convey that sense of worth and value that we can never find online. I think another thing that the church can provide is, if we look at the church's message, right? The church's message is the gospel, and the gospel is fundamentally a gospel of grace. So if social media has this temptation, or gives this temptation to treat it as a sort of performative art where we present our best selves, then the church ought to be the one place that we're allowed to show up not as our best selves, right? The church should be the place that we can actually show up in the midst of our weakness and brokenness and find safety there. And safety because the gospel is ultimately for sinners. The gospel is ultimately for people that don't have it all together. The gospel is ultimately for the person behind the Instagram feed of, post pictures and whatnot. And I think that's the power of the local church, is that it's a place where I think, Bonhoeffer says it's something like that it's a community of meeting one another as bringers of the message of salvation. So the way we relate to one another is that we are preachers of the gospel to one another. And that this is actually what binds us together as a community, is that we convey grace to one another in our preaching of the gospel to one another. And that frees us from some of the posturing or marketing of ourselves that social media can have such a tendency to drive us toward. It allows us to embrace some of our imperfection and receive grace in the midst of it. That's the last thing. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that reminder about presence from Henry Nouwen is important, because I think inherent in being present with people, because we live in a broken world, is it is more of what you were titling, authenticity. In other words, it's not a curated self, but that can be scary because people have been wounded, by relationships. So maybe that just comes with, understanding, okay, to be present with others in community will probably at some point result in something that could be wounding, but we can grow from those things. Whereas in social media, like you are saying, if it's performance art or it's a curated self, then you're not really getting authentic. You don't know who people truly are, right? Because they're not going to share, struggles that they're having with, if they're, my kids. Well, some people do. Some people just go all out and everything. But for most people, if they're having struggles, they post the happy pictures. They don't say, oh, I fought with my kids on the way to school today. They just post the cute pictures at soccer or whatever. So we, at the Christian Research Institute, we talk about being involved in a healthy, well-balanced church. So how is participating in a healthy, well-balanced church community, how will that shape our engagement on social media?
Yeah, so hopefully, like if we are in a healthy church, and I would say, like, any sort of involvement in this kind of immediate community always carries with it attendant risks. Like, there's no way to be in community without it involving the risk of hurting others and being hurt, and that's a hard thing to hear, and it's something that sometimes causes us to want to withdraw and say, well, that's why I find social media so comforting. But that risk is worth it because it provides, the opportunity for presence and grace, like we talked about. And if you have that as your backbone, it changes I think, what you're doing when you go on social media. So if we receive presence and grace from people in our immediate community of faith, and even if we, receive challenge from people in our immediate community of faith, that's going to make us better equipped to go into the social media world, not out of sort of a scarcity of the things that we need, but rather out of abundance. So we approach social media rather than sort of desperately in need of something that we can't find in the flesh. We instead approach social media as an extension of something that we already possess to a limited, sure, and imperfect, sure, but real sense. And so I think that's a significant thing to note, that basically the more we have a community around us originally or initially, the more we are rooted deeply in a community, the more responsible, the more helpful, I think, social media users will be. I really like. I read an article by a theologian named Alistair Roberts, and he uses this illustration I think is really helpful. He says the church is like the boat from which oxygen can be pumped to submerged divers, preventing them from drowning in the abyss and providing them with somewhere safe to which they can resurface. And his point is that we're basically better social media users when we're rooted in something other than social media. So the boat is the church, which is pumping oxygen to us as we dive deep into sort of the depths of social media and all of the potential opportunities that are there, as well as its attendant dangers.
Well, finally, I want to end with some fun rapid fire questions for Kyle. So, Kyle, enchiladas or soft tacos?
Enchiladas.
Are you an early bird or a night owl?
These days, an early bird.
Call or text?
Text.
Introvert or extrovert?
Definitely introvert.
And what's something that you learned in the last week? It could be informational or something that you learned personal growth-wise.
Oh, boy. I got to moderate a panel of various speakers kind of talking about origins in the creation debate, and I heard a position that I'd never heard before, arguing for a way of reconciling evolution with Christianity. It was completely interesting in the sense that I'd never heard the particular argument before.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, thanks, Kyle, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Thanks, Melanie. Appreciate you having me.
Today's guest, Kyle Keating, wrote a Postmodern Realities article in the Volume 41, Number 3 issue of the Christian Research Journal, and his article is called Cream or Sugar, Fostering Authentic Community in the Expanding Age of Social Media. To read Kyle's article, please subscribe to the journal. A 6-issue subscription is now at a new lower price of $33.50, and to subscribe, please visit our website, equip.org. We'd like to hear from you, so connect with us on social media. Like the Bible Answer Man Facebook page, and follow CRI Christian Research Journal, Hank Hanegraaff, and the Bible Answer Man on Twitter. Follow the Bible Answer Man on Instagram, and please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man channel on YouTube. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Postmodern Realities podcast on iTunes. And when you rate and review our podcast, it helps others to find our content. So please share this episode on your social media accounts. Be sure you tune in daily to the Bible Answer Man broadcast hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff, who answers your questions live on air. To ask Hank a question, call 888-ASK-HANK, Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. In addition, head to iTunes and subscribe to Hank Unplugged. It's Hank's new audio podcast. You'll follow Hank off the grid, where he has in-depth conversations with some of the brightest minds discussing topics you care about. So until our next Christian Research Journal author conversation, thanks for listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast.